In the United Kingdom, millions of pensioners live with one eye constantly fixed on their bank accounts, carefully watching their savings grow, shrink, and sometimes sit completely still. For many of them, the thought of crossing a certain threshold in their savings used to mean a little extra peace of mind, but now it feels more like stepping into a spotlight that shines directly into the offices of HMRC. Recent reports and discussions have fueled anxiety among older citizens, especially those who have managed to set aside a modest cushion of $3,000 or more. The question they are now asking themselves is whether they are about to be targeted, taxed more heavily, or dragged into financial complications they never imagined during retirement. The story is not a simple one, because it ties together the realities of fiscal drag, frozen tax thresholds, emergency taxation on pension withdrawals, and the broader issue of how Britain funds its commitments to an aging population. But to the pensioner sitting in a small bungalow, or to the retired couple relying on a combination of state and private pensions, it feels very personal, very urgent, and sometimes unfair. Imagine a man named George, 74 years old, who worked as a postman for over 4 decades. His life was simple, his salary modest, and his habits frugal. Over time, George managed to put aside just over $3,000 in savings. Hardly a fortune, but enough that he felt comfortable knowing he had something to fall back on if his boiler broke down or if he needed dental work not fully covered by the NHS. When George began hearing whispers that pensioners with savings beyond that small amount could find themselves targeted by HMRC, he felt the pit of worry settle deep in his stomach. He had always played by the rules, paid his taxes, never tried to hide a penny, and yet now he felt as though his small safety net had turned into a trap. George's story is not unique. Across the country, pensioners are wondering whether they will suddenly face unexpected tax letters, coded adjustments, or demands for repayments they did not anticipate. The fear comes not just from the possibility of paying more, but from the sheer complexity of navigating a system that already feels too confusing for many. To understand why these anxieties exist, you need to look at the bigger picture of how taxation and pensions intersect. The UK government, over the past several years, has chosen to freeze personal tax allowances, meaning that while the basic threshold remains stuck at $12,570, the actual income of pensioners continues to rise thanks to the triple lock on the state pension. The triple lock is meant to protect older citizens, ensuring their payments increase by whichever is highest among earnings growth, inflation, or 2.5%. In theory, that sounds like a blessing. In practice, however, those rising pensions combined with any savings interest or private pension withdrawals can push more and more retirees above the frozen threshold, making them liable for income tax even if they feel far from wealthy. This phenomenon, known as fiscal drag, is one of the main reasons so many pensioners now fear the taxman's knock at the door. When you throw savings into the mix, even modest amounts, the situation becomes even more complicated. If you have savings above $3,000, it is not that HMRC automatically swoops in to punish you, but that the income you generate from those savings through interest or investment returns can increase your taxable income. For those on the cusp of the threshold, that small boost in income can tip the balance, suddenly subjecting them to tax bills they never had before. And while $3,000 might not sound like much for someone on a fixed income who relies heavily on every pound, it feels like a line in the sand. The government does not officially say pensioners with that level of savings are a target, but in practice, that is how it feels. The real kicker comes when pensioners decide to access lump sums from their private pensions. Since the pension freedoms were introduced in 2015, people have been able to take out lump sums from their defined contribution pots, sometimes to cover large expenses, sometimes to support their families, and sometimes just to feel more secure. But HMRC has a system of applying emergency tax to those withdrawals. This means the tax is calculated as if the amount withdrawn were regular monthly income, leading to dramatic overtaxation. Pensioners have to claim refunds using forms like P55, P53Z, or P50EZ. While many eventually get their money back, the process can be daunting, time-consuming, and stressful, especially for those not comfortable with paperwork or online forms. Recently, reports showed thousands of pensioners were refunded an average of nearly $3,000 each after being hit by emergency tax, which adds to the narrative of unfairness. For someone who has withdrawn money for a genuine need, only to see a large chunk vanish into HMRC's hands and then face a bureaucratic maze to reclaim it, The system feels less like support and more like punishment. Now let's picture another pensioner, Margaret, a widow in her late 70s, who lives alone. She has a small occupational pension from her years working as a teaching assistant, along with her state pension. Margaret never imagined herself as a taxpayer in retirement, but the frozen thresholds and her small pot of savings that generates a few £100s a year in interest now mean she receives letters from HMRC. Each brown envelope fills her with dread, and each time she opens one, she worries she has done something wrong. Margaret's case reflects another growing reality. More than 8 million pensioners are projected to be paying income tax within the next few years, many for the very first time. For them, the very idea of being targeted is not abstract. It is experienced through real paperwork, tax code adjustments, and in some cases, reduced net income at a time when every pound counts. The sense of injustice is heightened by the fact that these pensioners did nothing wrong. They did what successive governments encouraged them to do: save responsibly, invest modestly, and prepare for their retirement. Now, those very savings and the incremental rises in their pensions are pulling them into tax brackets. To many, it feels like being punished for doing the right thing. And it's not just about money, it's about dignity, security, and trust. Pensioners expected their later years to be about stability and a little comfort, not unexpected battles with tax codes and refund forms. Public debate is now swirling around whether the government should raise the personal allowance or introduce more generous protections for pensioners. Advocacy groups argue that the current situation unfairly penalizes older citizens, especially those with modest savings who are not wealthy by any measure. On the other hand, the government faces immense fiscal pressures. With an aging population and rising demands on healthcare, pensions, and social care, officials argue that broadening the tax base is unavoidable. That leaves pensioners caught in the middle, caught between economic realities and political promises, between their own need for financial stability and the government's need for revenue. The narrative of $3,000 has caught attention because it is a figure that resonates with ordinary people. It is not about millions in offshore accounts or high-rolling investments. It is about a few £1,000s set aside over years of careful budgeting. To think that such a small cushion could draw the attention of HMRC feels disproportionate. Pensioners talk among themselves, in community centers and over cups of tea, about whether they are being singled out, whether they should spend their savings to avoid being noticed, or whether they should hide their modest pots under the mattress. Fear spreads easily when the system is complex, and trust in government feels shaky. And yet, amid the worry, there are also stories of resilience. Pensioners are learning to navigate online tax systems, leaning on charities and financial advice services, and even lobbying their MPs to raise awareness. Some have become surprisingly tech-savvy, using online calculators and tools to estimate their tax exposure. Others have joined local groups that share information about claiming refunds and managing tax codes. These small acts of empowerment show that pensioners are not passive victims, but active citizens determined to defend their rights. Still, for every empowered Margaret, there is a George who feels overwhelmed and vulnerable, highlighting the need for clearer communication from HMRC and stronger protections from policymakers. As the debate continues, one thing is certain: the issue is not going away. With the state pension set to rise again under the triple lock, more pensioners will be nudged into taxable territory. With savings rates improving slightly after years of low returns, more retirees will see modest interest that adds to their income. And with frozen thresholds extending further into the decade, the drag will only intensify. Unless significant policy changes are made, the number of pensioners feeling targeted will keep growing. For viewers of this story, the lesson is twofold. First, if you are a pensioner, awareness is your best defense. Understand your income, monitor how close you are to the thresholds, and seek advice if you find yourself confused. Do not ignore HMRC letters, as daunting as they seem, because timely responses can prevent bigger problems later. Second, recognize that this is not just your story, but part of a national conversation about fairness, taxation, and the treatment of older citizens. Your voice matters, and whether through voting, advocacy, or simply sharing your experience, you contribute to shaping the policies that will affect millions like you. The haunting part of this story is how small the sums involved are. £3,000 is barely enough for a holiday, a home repair, or a new mobility scooter, and yet it looms like a threshold between security and anxiety. It speaks volumes about the fragility of retirement in Britain today, where even modest savings feel unsafe from the grasp of taxation. And it challenges us all to think about what kind of society we want to live in. One where the elderly are constantly on guard, or one where they can live their later years in peace, knowing that their thrift and responsibility are rewarded, not penalized. So, the next time you hear about HMRC targeting pensioners with $3,000 or more in savings, remember that the truth is more complex than the headline suggests. It is not about a specific rule, but about the way the system interacts with small increments of income, frozen thresholds, and emergency tax processes. It is about how ordinary people experience those rules, not as abstract policy, but as very real letters, numbers, and anxieties. And most importantly, it is about dignity, the dignity of those who spent their lives working, contributing, and saving, only to find themselves wondering if they did it all for nothing. Their story is our story, because how we treat our pensioners says everything about the values we hold as a society.